I explained to him our arrangement with China. I explained to him what we're doing, 12 new deals on 4 continents in 6 months. He was impressed. And what we intend to do going forward, as well as the opportunity to, of course, move forward on CUSMA. You will note that Minister LeBlanc had discussions with one of his counterparts in the last 36 hours about some of the modalities and things on the way forward. But to be absolutely clear, and I said this to the President, I meant what I said in Davos. It was clear it was a broader set of issues, that Canada was the first country to understand the change in U.S. trade policy that he had initiated, and we're responding to that. We're responding positively by building partnerships abroad. We're responding positively by building at home, and we're prepared to respond positively by building that new relationship through CUSMA. He understood that, and it was a good conversation, as I say.
There are moments in geopolitics when the world doesn't shift with a bang, but with a sentence, a threat, a warning, a line spoken into a microphone that ripples across borders and boardrooms. When the President of the United States publicly threatens to impose a 100% tariff on every Canadian good entering the U.S. market, it isn't just a negotiating tactic. It isn't a warning shot. It is an assertion of power, a declaration that market access is conditional and that alignment is expected. But something unusual happened next. Canada did not retreat. Canada did not rush to reassure Washington. Canada did not escalate. Instead, Canada continued moving forward with a limited trade arrangement with China, quietly, legally, and deliberately. And then China responded, not with defiance, not with counter threats, but with a single sentence. This agreement is not intended to undermine anyone. That sentence matters, because it shifted the burden of justification. Suddenly, the question was no longer why Canada was diversifying. The question became why the United States was threatening its closest ally. To understand why this moment matters, we need to step away from the headlines and look at structure, because this is not a personality clash. It is a power test. A test of how sovereignty functions when a superpower decides that loyalty is no longer assumed but enforced. The U.S. threat was explicit. If Canada finalizes its China agreement, Washington will impose a 100% tariff on all Canadian exports. Not selective sectors, not targeted goods, everything. The stated justification is that Canada could become a transit point for Chinese products entering the U.S. market. But the scale of the threat reveals its real purpose. This is not about enforcement. It is about discipline. It is about reminding allies that access to the American consumer market is leverage, and leverage can be withdrawn, and that leverage is enormous. Nearly 3/4 of Canada's exports go to the United States. Over $2 billion in goods cross the border every day. Automotive parts, energy, food, steel, lumber, supply chains that have been integrated for decades. A 100% tariff would not merely disrupt trade, it would collapse it. It would raise prices across North America. It would hit U.S. manufacturers, U.S. consumers, and U.S. farmers almost immediately. And yet the threat was made anyway. Because this is how power is exercised in the current U.S. trade posture. Access first, rules second. Canada's response is what makes this moment different. Ottawa clarified that this is not a comprehensive free trade agreement with China. It is a narrow, sector-specific arrangement focused on tariff adjustments. The language was deliberate, calm, precise. And then came the line that signals strategy rather than submission. Canada will focus on what it can control. That is not weakness. That is middle power logic. Canada understands it cannot out-threaten a superpower, but it can out-time one, especially when the United States is approaching a moment it cannot afford instability. That moment is the USMCA review. This is the constraint Washington cannot escape. The trade framework that replaced NAFTA requires consensus. The U.S. cannot renew it alone. Canada's signature matters. Mexico's signature matters. A tariff war now would be economically self-destructive for the United States. North American manufacturing, especially autos, depends on components crossing the US-Canada border multiple times before final assembly. A single vehicle can cross that border up to 8 times. A 100% tariff would make that impossible. It would add thousands of dollars to vehicle prices. It would fuel inflation at a politically sensitive moment. And it would undermine Washington's own effort to build a continental manufacturing base to compete with China. In other words, the threat is loud, but the cost of enforcing it is high. This is where China's role becomes decisive. By publicly stating that its agreement with Canada is not meant to undermine anyone, Beijing altered the geometry of the dispute. It gave Canada diplomatic cover. It weakened Washington's framing, and it positioned China deliberately as the restrained actor. This is not altruism, it is strategy. China understands that when the US threatens an ally and China responds with reassurance, the contrast sends a signal far beyond Canada. It tells other middle powers that diversification is possible and that escalation is not inevitable. If Washington continues to escalate after China de-escalates, it risks appearing as the destabilizing force in North America. And that matters, because credibility is also leverage. What we are witnessing is not a bilateral dispute. It is a power triangle. The United States uses market size as coercive leverage. Canada uses timing, law, and restraint. China uses calm signaling and strategic patience. This is how power operates in a multipolar system. Canada did not seek this role, but it now occupies it, and it has advantages. If the US is preoccupied fighting Europe, pressuring Canada, and confronting China simultaneously, its bargaining power thins. A distracted superpower negotiates poorly. Canada gains room not by confrontation, but by positioning. Trade diversion follows the same logic. When tariffs rise between giants, supply chains reroute, investment looks for stability, and stability becomes valuable. Canada becomes the safe jurisdiction, the alternative production base, the predictable partner. These gains are quiet, incremental, but they compound. This does not mean Canada is immune to risk. A tariff spiral would still cause damage, supply chains would still strain. But relative positioning matters, and relative to the US, Canada's posture is disciplined. This moment also exposes a broader truth about the global system. The United States has increasingly used tariffs not as economic tools, but as instruments of alignment. China uses access and reassurance. Canada uses legality and timing. None of this is accidental. The question now is whether the US recalibrates or doubles down. Because if tariffs become a permanent disciplinary mechanism, allies will continue to hedge. Diversification will accelerate, and leverage will slowly dilute. The USMCA review will reveal whether this was a pressure tactic or the beginning of a more coercive trade order inside North America. What happens next will shape not just trade flows, but the architecture of alliances. Canada did not ask to be the hinge between two giants, but it is there now. Exercising sovereignty quietly, absorbing pressure without panic, and reminding the world that power does not always shout. Sometimes it waits. And sometimes that is enough. In the end, this moment is bigger than a tariff threat, bigger than a single agreement, bigger than the politics of any one leader. What we're watching is a glimpse of the world taking shape beneath the surface, a world where alliances are conditional, where markets are weapons, and where even the closest partners can find themselves on opposite sides of a power equation they didn't choose. Canada didn't ask to be the hinge between two giants, but here it is, caught between the gravitational pull of the United States and the rising influence of China, trying to carve out a space where sovereignty still means something. China didn't need to say much, just enough to shift the tone, enough to remind the world that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. And the United States, for all its strength, is discovering that leverage comes with limits, especially when the stability of an entire continent hangs in the balance. The USMCA review will come. The negotiations will begin. And behind every handshake, every press conference, every carefully worded statement, This moment will linger. The moment when a middle power stood its ground. The moment when China played the calm hand. The moment when the United States realized that even its closest allies have choices. What happens next won't just shape trade flows or tariff schedules. It will shape the architecture of North America. It will shape how countries navigate a world where economic interdependence no longer guarantees harmony. And it will shape how power is exercised in an era where threats travel faster than diplomacy and where the balance between cooperation and coercion grows thinner every year. So as the headlines fade and the next crisis takes their place, remember this: the story isn't over. The pressure points are still there. The incentives are still shifting. And the world is still watching to see whether this moment becomes a turning point or just the first tremor of something larger. Because in geopolitics, nothing ends cleanly. It only moves to the next chapter. And that chapter is already being written. This is Liberation Lens. See you in the next.